The fire took 4 hours. A palace built over 60 years, gone before dawn, cedar beams from Lebanon, gold inlay from the Indus, stone columns 40 feet tall, carved by masons who had never seen each other's homelands, working side by side on a single staircase. All of it burning at once, lighting the Zagros foothills orange, visible for miles across the Persian plain. The men who set the fire were drunk, or they weren't. Historians still argue about that detail, nearly 24 centuries later. What they agree on is this: by morning, the ceremonial heart of the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen was ash and blackened stone. This is the story of what stood there first, and the man who tried and failed to save it. You are standing on a stone platform the size of 10 football fields, raised above the Marvdasht plain in what is now southern Iran. It is early spring, the first light of the new year, and you are one of roughly 10,000 people who have made this pilgrimage. Delegations have arrived from 23 nations of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, Medes in rounded caps, Bactrians leading camels, Ethiopians carrying elephant tusks, Ionian Greeks with bolts of fine wool, Scythians in trousers, stitched with gold thread. This is Persepolis, built to be seen once a year, at Nowruz, when the empire renewed itself in front of its king. The Persepolis fortification tablets, thousands of clay records written in Elamite, unearthed centuries later, show exactly what this cost. Rations of wine, grain, and silver paid daily to workers from every province of the empire, some earning as little as 1.5 quarts of wine a month, others receiving payments in silver shekels for skilled labor that took decades to complete. Darius I began the platform around 518 BCE. His son Xerxes finished the great columned hall called the Apadana, wide enough to seat 10,000 guests beneath a roof held up by 72 columns, each one carved from a single piece of limestone and topped with the heads of twin bulls. The staircases leading up to that hall are the empire's most honest self-portrait. Carved into the stone, in an endless procession, are the tribute bearers of every subject people, walking in single file toward the throne, forever. A Lydian offers a vase, an Arab leads a dromedary, an Indian carries baskets of gold dust balanced on a pole. Nobody is chained, nobody kneels in submission. The message the Persian kings wanted carved into eternity was not conquest, it was order, a world so vast and so varied that it required a single point around which everything could turn. Compare that to the scale most of us are used to imagining for the ancient world, and the numbers still startle. At its height under Darius I, the Achaemenid Empire is estimated to have governed somewhere between 40 and 50 million people, roughly half the population of the entire planet at the time, spread across territory reaching from the Balkans to the Indus Valley. No empire before it had ever organized that much land, that many languages, and that much wealth under a single administrative system, with roads, postal relays, and standardized coinage tying provinces together that had nothing else in common. The air on the platform during Nowruz would have carried the smell of roasting meat, cedar resin from the newly built ceremonial halls, and the dust kicked up by thousands of sandaled feet crossing the same limestone pavement. Musicians played reed pipes and drums somewhere near the Gate of All Nations, the monumental entrance flanked by stone bullmen 20 feet tall, their beards carved in tight ringlets, their eyes once inlaid with colored stone that caught the morning light. Every visitor to Persepolis passed beneath those bullmen first, before they saw anything else, a deliberate piece of theater, designed so the empire announced its scale before a single delegate had even reached the stairs. Guards in patterned tunics stood at intervals along the processional route, and somewhere in the crowd, scribes recorded who had arrived, what they carried, and how much of it, because an empire this size ran not on conquest alone, but on paperwork, on grain counted by the bushel, and silver weighed by the shekel. That point had a name, Ahura Mazda, the god the Persian kings claimed had granted them the right to rule, and it had a city, though calling Persepolis a city undersells what it actually was. Unlike Babylon or Susa, Persepolis was not where the empire conducted its daily business. It was a stage. The real administration happened elsewhere, in Susa and Ecbatana, cities with markets and bureaucracies, and the noise of ordinary life. Persepolis existed for ceremony, for the treasury, and for burial. The tombs of the Achaemenid kings were cut into a cliff face nearby, facing the platform their bodies would never leave. Herodotus, writing decades before Persepolis was finished, described the Persians as a people who prized truthfulness above nearly every other virtue, who taught their sons three things above all: to ride, to use the bow, and to speak the truth. Whether or not that was accurate for every Persian who ever lived, it tells you what the empire wanted the world to believe about it: a place of order, honesty, and permanence. Inside the treasury complex, at the eastern edge of the platform, a Persian nobleman named Tiridates held one of the most consequential jobs in the ancient world. He was the treasurer of Persepolis, the man responsible for a fortune that later Greek historians would struggle to even describe in believable terms. Diodorus Siculus, writing 3 centuries later using earlier eyewitness accounts, put the sum at 120,000 talents of silver stored at Persepolis alone, a figure so large that even accounting for exaggeration, it represented the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of tribute from Egypt to the Indus River. Tiridates walked those storerooms daily. He knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what the empire was worth, and exactly what it would take to lose it. The vaults he oversaw held ingots, unminted bullion, and ceremonial vessels of gold and silver taken as tribute across 2 centuries, wealth that had traveled to Persepolis along the royal road, a highway some 1,600 miles long connecting Susa to Sardis, maintained by relay stations spaced roughly a day's ride apart so that a royal message could cross the width of the known world in under 2 weeks. Tiridates did not simply guard money. He understood, in a way few Persians outside the royal court could, how completely the empire's power and its physical treasury had become the same thing. 200 years of accumulated tribute does not vanish quickly. But by the time Tiridates held his post, the signs were already there, if anyone had been willing to read them. The Achaemenid Empire that built Persepolis had, by the middle of the 4th century BCE, spent generations fighting itself as often as it fought outsiders. Succession crises had toppled kings. Satraps, the provincial governors who ran the empire's day-to-day affairs, had grown wealthy and independent enough to rebel against the throne more than once. Darius III, the king who would face the empire's final test, had come to power in 336 BCE, not through a clean line of inheritance, but after a chief minister allegedly poisoned 2 kings in succession to install him as a controllable figurehead. He turned out not to be so easily controlled, but the empire he inherited was already showing cracks that a century earlier would have been unthinkable. Across the Aegean Sea, a 20-year-old had just become king of a minor northern Greek kingdom that most Persians, if they thought about it at all, considered a backwater. Alexander of Macedon inherited his father's army, his father's ambitions, and his father's unfinished plan to invade the Persian Empire. In 334 BCE, he crossed into Asia Minor with somewhere around 40,000 men. Persian commanders at the river Granicus underestimated him and lost. At Issus, in 333 BCE, Darius himself commanded the Persian army and lost again. Fleeing the battlefield so quickly, he abandoned his own mother, wife, and children to Alexander's camp. 2 years later, at Gaugamela, near modern-day Erbil in Iraq, Darius assembled what ancient sources describe as the largest army the Persian Empire had ever fielded. Chariots fitted with scythes on their wheels, war elephants brought from India, cavalry drawn from every corner of the empire. Alexander's force was a fraction of its size. On October 1st, 331 BCE, Alexander won anyway, and Darius fled east for the 3rd and final time. Even before Gaugamela, the empire's confidence had been fraying in ways its own court preferred not to discuss too loudly. Darius had already sent envoys to negotiate with Alexander twice, offering first a ransom for his captured family, then an offer to split the empire in half along the Euphrates. Alexander refused both times, a fact that should have told the Persian court everything it needed to know about what kind of war this actually was. It was not a border dispute to be settled with tribute and treaties, the way Persian kings had settled disputes with troublesome neighbors for 2 centuries. It was a war for the throne itself, And the Persian nobility, accustomed to a world where empires this large simply did not fall, kept treating it like the former, until it was unmistakably the latter. Persepolis itself was 700 miles from that battlefield, tucked behind a mountain range that had never been breached by a foreign army. For a while, distance felt like safety. It was not. In January of 330 BCE, Alexander's army reached a narrow mountain pass called the Persian Gates, the last natural barrier protecting the ceremonial heart of the empire. A Persian satrap named Ariobarzanes held that pass with a force ancient sources estimate at somewhere between 700 and several thousand men, against Alexander's advancing thousands. For roughly a month, Ariobarzanes held. It was by any measure one of the most effective last stands in ancient military history, until a captured local shepherd, under what Arrian's account describes as pressure, revealed a mountain track that let part of Alexander's force circle behind the Persian position. The pass fell. The road to Persepolis stood open. Inside the treasury, Tiridates understood what was coming faster than almost anyone in the city. He had watched Darius lose 3 battles in a row. He had heard what happened to cities that resisted Alexander outright. Thebes, back in Greece, had been razed to the ground and its population sold into slavery for defying him years earlier. Tiridates made a decision that would define the rest of his life, and possibly saved more than it destroyed. He sent a secret message ahead to Alexander's approaching army, offering to hand over the treasury intact, without a fight, in exchange for the city's safety. It is one of the earliest documented acts of a besieged official choosing collaboration over annihilation, and ancient historians recorded it without the moral judgment a modern reader might expect. Survival, in the 4th century BCE, was not a small thing to negotiate for. Alexander's army entered Persepolis in January of 330 BCE, and for the ordinary residents of the city, the artisans, the administrators, the households that had nothing to do with kings or armies, what followed was brutal in ways the ceremonial reliefs on the Apadana staircase had never depicted. Diodorus and Quintus Curtius Rufus both describe days of looting and violence against the civilian population. Soldiers let loose on a city they had been told, falsely, was the source of every Greek grievance against Persia, going back to the burning of Athens by Xerxes a century and a half earlier. It was, by the standards even of ancient warfare, an ugly and painful chapter, and no amount of imperial grandeur on either side made it less so for the people who lived through it. The treasury, at least, Tiridates' gamble preserved. Alexander took possession of that staggering fortune in silver and gold without a fight, wealth that would go on to fund his campaigns for years and permanently reshape the economies of the ancient Mediterranean by flooding it with Persian bullion. Ancient sources describe a logistical operation almost as staggering as the treasure itself. Thousands of mules and hundreds of camels requisitioned simply to carry the silver out of the vaults and onto the road. A convoy long enough that soldiers posted at either end of it could not see one another. 2 centuries of accumulated tribute, weighed shekel by scribes whose names no one recorded, left the mountain platform in a single season, never to return. The palace itself survived the initial sack. It stood, mostly untouched, for months, while Alexander used Persepolis as a base and continued pursuing Darius eastward. Then, sometime around May of 330 BCE, according to the accounts of Diodorus and Plutarch, a banquet was held inside the Apadana hall itself. Wine was poured for hours. A woman named Thais, present among the Greek company that night, is said to have proposed, whether in jest or in earnest, the ancient sources disagree, that they set fire to the palace of the kings who had burned Athens. I hope you like my video. If you like it, hit that subscribe button and leave a like, and you can also check my YouTube channel. And bye, see you in next video.